This is what we talked about the day that we introduced the project, right? We said she's a model of devotion to her people and her God. All you women would do well to emulate her character, but are we really sure? Because that's, it's a really popular book, and that's the way it's normally approached. So the very first day of class, this is what I showed you. And you know that whether or not I've said it explicitly or not, it has been the driving force of everything we've done in class. It is the thing, I think, that probably has changed the class more than anything else, is always asking ourselves, what is God revealing about himself here? And if there were ever a time to not abandon this, today is the day. So, the return to the land, we've talked about this. Remember that even though, if we've got Jerusalem over here and Babylon here and Susa up there, this book is not written to the people up there. It's written about them. And it's written to the people who are back here in the land, to God's people who have cared enough to come back to the land and are struggling to worship in spite of some really bitter disappointments. So we talked about the return in 536 and why it wasn't all as expected to be. There's no king. There's this squatty little temple. God doesn't come back to his home. And the biggest problem is it just looks like God's given up on the relationship. Easy for us to say, no, he hasn't. But for them in that situation, it's a really, really hard question. God, do you care? And this is where the little book becomes so, so important, because to these people who are saying, God, we want to go up and worship you, but you haven't come back to your home. Have you abandoned us? And God says, that's such a really, really good question. Let me just tell you a story about a little girl in a very faraway place. And so he does, for the benefit of these people. All of this, of course, happens, as we saw before, during the post-exile. So she could be back in the land because these people are back in the land, but she's not, and we'll talk about that again. Right? So one last thing, again, we've said this before, but just to re-emphasize it, Esther is almost the last book in the Old Testament chronologically. Since we're expected to bring everything God has said before with us to study a particular book, then realize we must bring the entire Old Testament to bear and allow it to speak to our understanding of this book. I think probably the biggest mistake in misunderstanding Esther is just going back and ripping it right out of the context, pretending it's just a single little book about romance and courage. And don't think of it that way. Think of Esther as if you want to think of Esther personified as, the book as a person. Think of Esther standing here, not alone, but right next to her is Daniel. And right on the other side is Moses. And right behind her is Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea and Gomer and Ruth and David and all the other books. And so we're going to take this book, we're going to take this person, we're going to understand it in light of everything we've seen, because as we say so many times before, God doesn't repeat himself over and over and over again. Right? He expects you to know what he has taught us so far. So we bring all that with us to understand what this book is all about. So, as we said, do you agree or disagree? Is God present? And again, this is a very, very unusual book, because his name isn't mentioned, law isn't mentioned, worship isn't mentioned, and that's why people between the Testaments came up with the additions to Esther to help Esther out, because she wasn't sufficient on her own. The book wasn't sufficient because it doesn't mention God or prayer or anything like that, and so we have this and people feel better about it. And again, I think we said at least this is honest in the sense that they just say, God got it wrong, so we're going to help him out. What we do, the evangelical trick, is to say, well, no, God didn't get it wrong, but here, we'll help him out in the interpretation. And we come up with the same stuff by saying, well, I'll bet she did this, or I bet she didn't do this, or I bet this were her motives. So this little book, Esther and Her Elusive God, How a Secular Story Functions as Scripture, I think has it exactly right. How can you have a story that if you didn't know it fit in the Bible, you'd never guess that it would? How does it function as Scripture? And it absolutely does. It's absolutely, completely, 100% inspired in a beautiful, literary genius sort of a way that escapes most people. So, how does it function? Well, we'll find out. Is she a role model? She lives on foreign soil. We talked about that. She eats the king's food, hides her Jewishness, and she wins a contest of pretty questionable standards, especially when you realize, again, putting this in context, we haven't looked at Ezra and Nehemiah, but the thing which Ezra and Nehemiah both get on the people back in the land for is marrying non-Jewish people. Right? Just take a look at Ezra and Nehemiah. That's what they're both upset about. And they say, you've got to divorce your wives because this is a horrible thing to do, to marry unbelievers, non-believing pagans who live in the land. So that's what they're saying here. How in the world do we get away with it over there? Right? That's one of the questions. So is Mordecai a good guy? I mean, we tend to think of him as a good guy. He is in some ways the hero of the book. Is he an upstanding guy? Well, this is not a simple black and white third grade story. This is a very college level, adult level story. And I don't mean adult in the some sort of sexual sense. I mean adult in its complicated, in its richness, in its complexity, in its nuance. Is he a good guy? Well, he is the hero of the story. Does that mean he's good? I don't know. Have you ever seen a hero of a story who was flawed, who had character flaws? Well, the writer tells us twice that Mordecai has a lineage, tells us twice. And twice it traces his lineage back to a guy named Shimei. I don't know if you guys did this or not, or if I honestly don't remember if I clued you into this or not. But if you go back, you can find out who Shimei is. And Shimei is a relative of Saul who had a big grudge, of course, against David. And so one time when David was fleeing Jerusalem because Absalom was coming after him, this guy named Shimei threw stones at David and all of King David's servants, as well as all the people and the soldiers who were on his right and on his left. As he yelled curses, Shimei said, "Leave, leave, you man of bloodshed, you wicked man, get out of town." Talk about kicking a guy while he's down. This is what Shimei does. It's not the way you treat the Lord's anointed. So David and his men went on their way, but Shimei kept going along the side hill opposite him, yelling curses as he threw stones and dirt at them. Now, Joab says, "David, this is horrible for this guy to do this to you. Let me go cut his head off right now. Please, just give me the permission. I'll go do it right now. That's what ought to be done." David says, no, don't do that. I mean, maybe this is God's punishment for me. Don't do that. Joab says, "Well, I'm telling you, that's what should be done, and I want to do it." David said, "No, don't do it." So he didn't do it. But eventually, under Solomon did do that because that's exactly what he deserved. Now, why does the writer tell you that Mordecai comes from this guy? Well, because if you notice the lineage of Haman, you notice this. He's an Agagite. What's an Agagite? Agagite are people who come from a long line of very narrow esophaguses, and so when they get a little food, no, that's not right. They come from this guy, right? And this goes back to the story of Saul, where Saul was supposed to destroy all the Amalekites, and Samuel told him to do that, and he says, "I destroyed them all, except I brought back their sheep, and I brought back their king." Now, I don't know how you say this with a straight face. "I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king." Yeah, right. So Samuel really lights into him and says, "Has the Lord his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices and obeying the voice of the Lord?" Right? You should have done this. And then the Agag comes to him and says, confidently thinking, "Well, surely the bitterness of death is past." And Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women." Now, I don't know if you catch this. This is a Middle Eastern way of saying you're in trouble, right? If someone says your mom is about to be childless, that's a bad thing for you. Okay? And Samuel does what Saul should have done, and he put Agag to death before the Lord of Gilgal. Now, why? Why all this background? Well, because the writer is trying to say Haman comes from Agag, Shimei comes from Saul. So why is there anger? Why is there antipathy between them? Because for generations their families have been, in conflict. And you say, well, that was generations ago. Does that kind of thing go down through generations? Ever been to the Middle East? Yeah, absolutely. Right. So why won't he bow down to him? Well, the book is trying to say, if you understand the history, you won't bow down to him, not necessarily because of religious faith, but because he hates the guy. So with that background then, let's jump into the book. So here we have chapter 1. What a great story. 180-day display of his wealth and glory, and then a 7-day smashing good, pun intended, party to finish it. The king knows how to party, but is he in control? Chapter 1 and verse 10 clearly says, "On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine." Right? So this guy is totally, completely happy because he's intoxicated, right? He's not in control, right? The text actually says that. And so he asks for Vashti to come out. Of course, she won't do it. We can speculate as to why, but it doesn't really matter. She won't come out. And when she doesn't come out, he doesn't know what to do. It's like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? So here's the weird thing. Instead of simply going and speaking to his wife, guess what he does? Right? He grabs all the counselors together. Now, that should be kind of a clue to you right there, right? I mean, doesn't this guy can't even control his own home? Does he not even talk to his wife? Why do you have to get your counselors together? And the counselors just go nuts. And one guy named Memucan comes along in verse 16 with, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of the provinces of the king Xerxes, whose queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come, right? There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Now, what I want you to understand is this, and I hope you caught this reading through. Did you enjoy this book? Did you enjoy reading the story here? I hope if you did that you were a fairly critical reader, that you didn't take it too seriously. Now, I don't mean that it's not inspired. I absolutely do. But what I mean is, this is supposed to be a comedy. Right? Don't look at this and think, oh, this Memucan is a wise counselor, and he's right, and if this happens, it'll be the end of the kingdom. No, this is who Memucan is, okay? This is how you should understand him. Memucan is an idiot. Or maybe this guy, he's a buffoon. He's just a silly character, and you're supposed to look at chapter 1 and think, are you serious? Do you really think the whole kingdom's going to fall apart because the queen said no to the king one time? Come on, right? And what you're looking at here in chapter 1, if you're a critical reader, is you're saying this, is anybody in control? These guys are a bunch of idiots. They're a bunch of buffoons, and they absolutely are. And that's a really, really, really important question, because you know what the answer is? Is anybody in control? And the answer is nobody is in control at all, except for one person, and he's the only person whose name doesn't show up in the book. God is in control of this because none of the humans are. Right? But there's someone who is in control, and it's not these guys, because they're either smashed out of their minds or they're just buffoons. All right? So how in the world could anything good come out of this? Well, because there is some supernatural background going on. So that leads us then, yeah, that's who's in charge right there. That leads us then to this. Esther is made queen. Remember the rules of the contest. We've seen those. We met Mordecai. We didn't want to miss his lineage. He comes from Shimei. And the four things about Esther that you notice right here off the bat are her diet, her witness, and her morality. And again, you know, all you have to do is compare her, stand her up next to Daniel, and see what you think. And again, I understand. I know this is hard on some of you. I know that some of you think, no, wait a minute, I've had this understanding of Esther. She's a role model. She's a courageous person. I want to do that too. We don't have very many female role models, so don't be messing with this one. I understand that. I get that. But again, all of us simply want to know what the Scripture says, right? So when we look at this and we compare her to Daniel, sometimes she is justified in her actions, like hiding her ethnic origin, because if she didn't, she could be killed. Like, okay, then that's reason enough to sin, right? But then again, you look at Daniel, and he was risking his life all the time. You always have a choice to say yes or no. You might get thrown into a fiery furnace, but if you do, you do, right? That's the way of faith. It's not to hide these things. So then finally, her success, she does become queen, and she becomes queen at the expense of all those other things. And again, you know the story. Not to put too fine a point on it, but I say, okay, if you have to break God's law, right, in ways that are critical to you as a person, if you have to hide your witness, if you have to sleep with pagan people who you're not married to, if that is your standard, then she is your role model. Great success. Now again, am I trying to make her out to be a bad person? Do I have a vendetta against her? No, I don't. But follow me to the end and see how this whole thing plays out. Right? So Mordecai rescues the king. You know that, but he's not rewarded for it. Strangely, ironically, Haman gets rewarded in the next couple of verses and has this plot to exterminate the Jews because he hates them, of course. And when we meet Haman, we notice that he is an Agagite, and so again, he just hates this Jewish guy, and this goes back generations. Mordecai would not bow down or pay him honor. Now again, we don't know exactly why. If you really want to put a positive spin, you can say, well, it's because it was wrong for Jewish people to bow down to other kings. Well, I mean, I don't know where you get that from. Is it an issue of religious faith to not bow down in honor of a court official? did Daniel do it? And the answer is yes, of course he did. Daniel was always respectful of the king, always bowed down to him, always said, "Long live the king," right? That's the way you approach him. It's not a worship of the king. It's just a way you respect. But he won't do it. And the best reason we have in the text is because they are ancestral enemies of one another. So, again, I find this a little bit ironic, too, that even at the end of the book, he's kind of shown up as the hero. That's true, but he's also the troublemaker, right? If he just hadn't done this, it wouldn't cause the whole problem in the first place. So they cast the Pur to figure out what day they're going to destroy the Jewish people on. So that's what a Pur is. Of course, we would call it a die in singular, right? That's a Pur. But in the plural, it is a dice or Purim, and that's where the name of the festival comes from. Even there is a bit of huge irony, right? They just by a game of luck or chance, they figured out what day would be the day of slaughter, and God overruled that luck or chance or those fools and made it a day of deliverance rather than a day of slaughter. And so, again, even there, the name is a piece of irony that goes to God's salvation. So what happens next, of course, is this. Esther's decision to approach the king. Mordecai goes to her and says, "Look, you got to go. You got to go or we're going to die." And she comes back and she says, "Sorry, cousin, it's been 30 days and I'm not going." Now, again, hate to burst your bubble if you feel like this is a Disney romance, but here's another little indication it ain't a Disney romance. It's been 30 days since she's talked to her husband. This is not a close relationship. Right? This is not a romantic relationship as we think of it. This is a pagan, ancient deal. King has concubines who give him children. This is not a lifelong soulmate companion. If you haven't figured that out, go back and look at the text very carefully, and you realize that after they have that very first contest of assembling all the virgins, let the king sleep with each one at a time, and then figure out who's going to be the queen. Realize that after that happens and after she becomes the queen, did you notice it says they assembled the virgins again? They did it again. Not the same ones. They weren't virgins anymore. They went into the concubine portion of the harem. They just did it again because he thought the contest was a whole bunch of fun, right? So don't insert any emotional warmth into this whole thing. I can't go because he hasn't called for me for 30 days. And I'm afraid I will die if I go. This is not the kind of loving relationship you might want it to be, but that's where we are, this kind of pagan culture. So Mordecai comes to her then, and Mordecai says in 4:14, he says this, "If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish." Now again, what does he mean by that? And the trouble is that none of us can say for sure. I mean, I would like to say, when he says another place, he's talking about somewhere else, not God. Other people might want to say, no, he's talking about God there, right? And I would say, well, neither one of us can say that for sure. Because it doesn't say, he just says another place. All I can say is this, if he did mean the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, wouldn't this have been a great place to say it? Right? Wouldn't this have been a great place to say, I know there is a God in heaven who will rescue us, but he doesn't do that. Furthermore, there's a little bit of trouble with the meaning of the sentence just by the way it's listed there. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Did you ever wonder how those two fit together? I mean, if relief and deliverance does arise, then why would she perish? Well, there could be a translation problem here, and again, I go back to John Donne here in this book and another book he cites by name, a big scholar in the NIV application commentary named Russ Bush. And he says, the punctuation is not easy to figure out. It could easily be translated like this. Now notice we haven't changed the words. We just made it a declaration into a question mark, which is very, very grammatically possible. If you remain silent at this time, will relief and deliverance for the Jews arise from another place? Question mark. And you and your father's family will perish. And really, this makes more sense to me. Because what he's saying to her is, look, if you don't go in, do you think somebody else is going to help us out? And that's the reason. If nobody else helps us out, if you don't go and nobody else helps us out, that is why then you and your father's family will perish. So I think what's actually happening here is Mordecai's persuasion is, look, you're our only hope, which makes total sense in this situation. I'm not going to go. I could die. And he says, look, if you don't, we're all going to die. You've got to go. You are our only hope. Help's not going to rise from anywhere else. So you've got to go. Right? So she says, okay, all right, you put it that way. I guess I will go. Right? And again, I don't blame her. I mean, nobody wants to risk their life if you don't have to. But with that persuasion, I guess you go. So she says then, fast for us and pray. Now again, I put in parentheses and pray because it ain't really there. And again, you can argue this thing both ways. You can say, well, everywhere else in the Bible where people fast, they also pray. And I would say yes. And because of that, because of the fact that it's left out here, we should not insert it. We should leave it alone and say, wow, that kind of seems strange to us. You say, well, she has to be a Jewish believer to do this. And the answer is, no, you don't. Every religion in the world fasts. Everybody fasts when they're desperate and they need help. So it doesn't say who she's hoping to get help from. All right? I'm just trying to be objective here and go with the story as it is. So fast for me. Okay, we will do that. So what happens? Well, it turns out pretty well, even though it's kind of funny. And this is where the plot really thickens and gets really fun. And this is why I think this book should be made into a play. This is just such fantastic timing and irony and humor all rolled into one. We start out with a slow start in 5:1 to 8 because what she says is, okay, I want you and Haman to come to the big feast, and then I will tell you what I want. And so they come to the big feast. It's kind of a fun time. It's what they do. And the king says, what do you want? She says, what I want is, oh boy. You ever had one of those times when you were trying to make a big announcement and you just couldn't do it? And I think that's where she is. Again, I don't fault her for it, but she says, what I really want is, come back again tomorrow night and I'll tell you. All right? Okay, that's good. We like feasting. We'll come back again tomorrow night, which perfectly sets us up then for this day and night's worth of intrigue. And what happens, of course, is this. Haman goes home to his wife and he boasts about three things. Chapter 5 is this. He boasts about his wealth, he boasts about his sons, and he boasts about his honor. Right? The text says in chapter 5, verse 11, Haman boasted them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. Yes, that's great, because she's going to kill you. But anyway, he says, this is really great. I've gotten everything I want. I feel like an important person, but there's this one thing that gives me problems. And it's this Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. And verse 14, his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to dinner and be happy. Right? I get the impression his wife is saying, you big whiner, just kill him and put a happy face on. Okay? And again, the text is supposed to be funny, I think. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. Hey, that's a good idea. Let's do it. Right? Now, so I got to explain to you a little bit about this gallows, right? How high does the gallows need to be for a 5-foot man? 75 feet, is that overdoing it a little bit, right? But the other thing I need to say is this, that we tend to think of, an 1860s out west form of execution, and that's not really a gallows, right? In this culture, no one hung anyone by the neck. What they actually did was they did string them up, so to speak, but they would string them up, and here's an actual relief of what they would do. This is very, very common. That's a wooden pole, and they impale them. Right? It's a really, really gross thing. But even so, why would you impale someone 75 feet up? Well, you get into the mind of the culture, and it makes total sense. What you're doing is, the way you humiliate your enemy is you take them and you put their corpse way up in the air and expose their corpse. Right? This is one of the worst things that can happen in the Old Testament. If you don't take your corpse and bury it and you expose it, it's ultimate shame, and the birds come and eat the thing. And in fact, this is one of the ways that we demonstrate, that the people would demonstrate, and even God would demonstrate, that God's wrath has fallen on a person like this. There are a couple places where there are plagues that occur for various reasons in the Old Testament, and the solution is God says, take that person who did the evil deed and hang him up. It doesn't mean by a rope, it means this kind of thing, expose their body so the curse of God can go on them. Now, this is not intended to be a reference to the cross, but it's the same thing going on. Jesus was hung on a tree. He was impaled on a wooden pole because he took the curse of God for the rest of the world. It's the very same Middle Eastern background. Now, this is not some sort of foreshadowing of it. It's just another instance of it, right? So what's going on here is his wife says to him, look, humiliate him, even in death. Put him 75 feet up so everybody can see your wrath falling on this guy. Okay? And so he says, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So what happens the next day, of course, is this. The insomniac king decides to honor Mordecai. And this is one of the sweetest parts of the whole story because he can't sleep. And so he just says, okay, somebody put me to sleep. Read something really boring to me. Right? Get out the court records. And in those court records, of course, is the story of Mordecai rescuing him. So as you read through chapter 6, it's just perfectly written like all of it is. But verse 3 says, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. So obviously you know what's coming next, right? What have we done? He saved my life. What have we done? Nothing. Right? The king said, nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Next verse, verse 4. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. So you see here that Mordecai's in the middle, king's on one side, Haman's on the other side. And it's this big, huge conflict, this standoff. The king's coming from one side, Haman's coming from the other. King is thinking, I've got to honor him, I've got to honor him, I've got to honor him. Haman's thinking, oh, I want to kill him, I want to kill him, I want to kill him. And boom, they come and they meet together. And the king says to Haman, hey, I need some help. Oh, what? Well, I want to honor someone that I really, really love. That is really special to me. And of course, Haman in his pride is thinking, oh, I see what's coming here, right? And he says, what shall I do for the guy that I want to honor? And Haman says, well, let me just think about it here. Let's see. I think it would be good if one of the king's trusted servants would put that person on a horse and parade them through the city and say, this is what I do for the guy I really want to honor. And the king looks at him and says, that's a great idea. You lead the horse for Mordecai, right? And at that point, I'm sure Haman's jaw just drops and says, oh, what? And then, you know, they're like, oh, no. And this is a total reversal of Haman's hopes, right? Because he wants to kill Mordecai, and now he has to honor Mordecai. And all of the things he wanted for himself, his enemy is getting. This is part of that role reversal kind of thing. And I'm sure he decided, well, maybe this is not a good time to talk about killing the guy, right? So I kind of like this picture because I think that shows the angst on his face, like, no, this is the absolute thing I didn't want to do. And so he goes home, totally ruins his day, goes home to his wife, tells his wife what goes on, and this is really fascinating. His wife has this about face, right? His wife says, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Now, let's apply the same standard here we did to Mordecai, right? You think Zeresh is a believer in Yahweh? No, she's not a believer in Yahweh. She's a good Zoroastrian, right? But she notices that this guy is of Jewish origin. Now, the thing is, she knew that yesterday when she decided to kill him, right? She already knew that. But now she's saying, oh, wait, let me put two and two together. I've noticed that when Jewish people get into trouble, somehow they end up on top. I don't know how that is. Right? Maybe there are gods behind them or something. But anyway, she is an astute observer of history and says, oh, buddy, you are in trouble. Thank you very much, wife. I appreciate the encouragement. You will surely come to ruin. And her words are exactly right. Because that evening at the dinner, she does come up with the courage and says, by the way, a small secret to tell you, we've been married for years, and I haven't told you, I am Jewish. Again, not exactly the closest of relationships. And by the way, Haman is trying to kill me. So, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Talk about bad luck and bad timing, so to speak. And the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house? Now, everybody knows he's not actually trying to molest the queen. Everybody knows that he is pleading for his life, and he just stupidly stumbles on top of her. But, you know, everybody hates him, will use any excuse, right? And so the attendants see this and think, this guy has history. They put a bag over his head. Not a good time to fall on top of the queen. Where can we find good gals? Hey, there's a new 75-foot one right over there. So, again, this total reversal of the hopes. So, in the victory, of course, the Jews are enabled to defend themselves, and the preparation for victory is this. First of all, Mordecai gets Haman's honor, his signet ring, gets his wealth, but not his blank. Right now, I hope you recognize these are the three things that he boasted about. He boasted about his wealth and his honor and his sons, right? But at this point, he doesn't get the sons. He just gets the wealth and the honor. So the story is a little bit incomplete. So they have this day of slaughter. Israel slaughters all of her enemies on the day of Purim. And the king comes to Esther and says, well, sweetie, how'd you like that? She said, oh, it was wonderful. But two things. Number one, can we just put all of Haman's sons on the pole? Right? And number two, can we have a second day just to kill more people? Because it would really feel good. Let's do it all again tomorrow. Okay, you got it. So that's what happens. So Mordecai finally gets Haman's sons. So what does this book mean here? What does it mean in the Old Testament? What does it mean for how we understand what God is doing? Let's do this. First of all, let's start here and take a look at what is sort of a caption at the end of this book for what God is doing. The evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that I think is kind of the biggest statement of what's going on that describes so many of these reversals. He wanted bad for them, but it ended up on him. I hope that sounds familiar. Right? If you had to pick out a verse in the Bible that would describe that very phenomenon for Israel, what would it be? I'm going to curse those who curse you, right? Now, we keep hearing that. We keep hearing that. The Old Testament people keep hearing that. Why is that important here? Well, it's because of this. Remember where we are. And what I mean is this. We have come to the end of the Old Testament. We have seen these wonderful, beautiful, amazing, bright, clear promises pointing us forward. But there's one small problem with where we are in the Old Testament right now. And where we are is we're right over here. You know what this means? What this means is this, that all of that stuff doesn't matter anymore. None of it matters. Because we don't have a king, and we don't have a God in the temple, and we don't have a Urim and Thummim, and we have this squatty little temple. And the trouble is that the post-exile brings all of those bright promises into absolute background, blurry vision. It's like, wow, does any of that mean anything? And when these people are over here and they're saying, God, do you care? And God says, let me tell you a story about a little girl far away. What the story of Esther does, I think, more powerfully than any kind of straightforward answer would do, is this. What Esther does is it comes along and it takes that question mark and just pushes it out of the way. I don't know if you understand how this is working or not, but I think what it's saying is this, and this is really, really powerful. This is critical. What it's saying is this. If God is still caring for his people, even when they don't care for him, the promises are still unconditional. I hope this makes sense to you. I hope you understand here. I'm not out to take away another female role model from people who desperately want one. But I think to try to say that Esther is a good girl is like going back and trying to say that Gomer is a good girl. If you understand the story of Hosea and Gomer, you understand the story doesn't mean anything if she's good. Anybody can marry a Ruth. To marry a Gomer takes an incredible supernatural commitment. And we always want to make Esther to be a good girl because we so firmly believe in our little black and white, God does good things to good people and bad things to bad people, and so we got to be good and courageous. And the truth is, that's not great. There's no place for grace in that whole story. No place for grace. The only hope that you and I have is the fact that there's a Hosea out there, and one greater than Hosea, who's going to love us as we are. And the truth is that none of us on our own are Ruths. Every one of us is a Gomer down deep inside. And to know that there's a Hosea out there who will love us in spite of ourselves to know that there is a God who says, no, it really is unconditional. I'm going to care for you even when you don't care enough to even mention my name. The thought of praying to me never even occurs to you. You find yourself in an incredibly tense situation, and what do? You manipulate and you fast, but you never pray to me. You never mention my name. You never call on me. You'll manipulate your way into positions of authority for what good? No good, but I'm still there even when I am totally absent from your minds and your mouths. I am still there caring for you. Now take all of that and put it back over here and see the answer and see how it would feel to these people in the land. God, we're really struggling. Man, we're trying. We fail and stuff, and we don't get it right every time. But have you thrown us away because we fail sometimes? And God's answer is, look, come on, don't you understand this at all yet? If I'm taking care of those people over there, how much more do you think I will take care of you? If while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, Romans 5, how much more, being his friends, will he care for us and take us all the way? And that's part of the reason why I love this book so much. It's such a powerful statement about our grace and where we are, and it gives a realistic picture of what she's doing and how she's living. Right? She's not being blessed because she's good. We don't need more courageous people. We need a greater vision of the God who really does mean what he says. The reason we would need that is because we just still find it so hard to believe. Let me talk about that more in a second. Right now, I want to go on to the second phase of what we've been doing here in the Old Testament. We've been teaching you the stories, we've been teaching you the content, but we've also been teaching you, the skill of how you interpret on your own. How do you know what God is saying in the book? And I don't know if this little picture looks familiar to you. I know that some of your Spiffo profs probably used it, probably others didn't. But I like it because what it represents is the method that we're trying to use in class every day. We're trying to start over on the left-hand side, make observations about the text, figure out what the author's big idea is, and then make applications from that. Now, that's not the way a lot of people do it. In fact, if you're an amateur and you haven't had any training, that's not the way you do it. Here's what you do. You look at a book, you pick out a tidbit that seems meaningful in the midst of all the other historical stuff you don't understand. And you say, well, I think Mordecai was courageous. And I've noticed, too, that Esther stands up for her people. So I'm going to go to this book, and here's what I'm going to find. I'm going to find out that I'm going to be courageous for Jesus, too. And okay, I'm glad for people to be courageous. That's good to find role models to be courageous. But the trouble is, if that's your hermeneutical principle, if that's the depth of your understanding of interpretation, there is absolutely nothing to keep you from doing this too. It's right there in the book. It tells you clearly. Is that what you want to do? Is that how you want to interpret? No, we wouldn't say that. Well, why not? Because your method leads you right to that. What we've been trying to do all semester long is this. Let's take all this stuff and boil it down and try to say, what does this tell me about God? And I think what it tells us is this very simple statement, that God is faithful to his people even when they are faithless to him. You say, that's not nearly as sexy as the courageous thing. Oh no? Oh no? Number one, let's let God determine what's important for us to see, and let's explore what this would mean for us for a second. Number one, if God is faithful to his people even when they are faithless to him, then that tells me for my theology that God will be faithful to Israel and gives me some sort of hope for the future of the nation. Because trust me that today, the nation of Israel is just like Esther. It's just like Gomer. I think I probably told you my friend who's speaking to a Jewish soldier and said, do you believe in a coming Messiah? And she patted the submachine gun on her hip and said, this is all the Messiah we need. 95% of Jewish people are as secular can be today. Are they patriotic? Yes. Do they believe in their country? Yes. Do they believe in their God? Absolutely not. Could care less. 4% are Orthodox and are still looking for another Messiah because they've rejected Jesus as the one. Only 1% of Jewish people today in Israel have any sense that Jesus is the Messiah. Does God care for the 99%? Yeah, this book tells me he does. But then it even goes and gets more personal because I say, okay, maybe if this is true, maybe that should cause a little bit of humility on my part because of God's faithfulness when I have been faithless to him. Have you ever had those times in your life? Have you noticed those times in your life? You've had them. Have you noticed them? Sometimes when God is good to me, it is the kindness of God that leads me to repentance because I realize, oh, God, I don't deserve that. I don't deserve that. I am such a wretch. And yet you have been good to me. Yeah, that's the story. And then how about this one? My behavior, I want to be faithful to those who are faithless to me. Oh, that doesn't sound very exciting. No, but I'm telling you what, that is central to the gospel. That is central to the change which Jesus makes in us. Why do I want to do that? Because I want to be like my dad, and this is what my dad's like. My dad does this. And so as a son of God, as a daughter of God, this is what I want to do too. Because if anything describes the gospel, it's got to be, Father, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. You can be on a cross and people are nailing you to it and you say, oh, God, would you forgive them? Because they don't know what they're doing. You know what? That's Jesus' Spirit. That is God's Spirit. Don't bring all your friends over for dinner. Bring people who can't pay you back and be good to people who despitefully use you. And that's the way the world will understand that God has made an incredible difference in our lives. I love the way Donald Miller has said it like this. He talks about how you know you're accepted. I know this is too small to read, but let me read it for you. He says, imagine how much a man's life would be changed if he trusted that he was loved by God. Again, you might say, we keep hearing this from you. We keep hearing this from the Old Testament. Yeah, we do, but probably because it's so hard for our hearts to get it. It's so hard to believe that we could really be totally loved. Right? But listen to this. Imagine how much a man's life would be changed if he trusted that he was indeed loved by God. He could interact with the poor and not show partiality. He could love his wife easily and not expect her to redeem him. He would be slow to anger because redemption was no longer at stake. He could be wise in giving with money because money no longer represents points. He could give up formulaic religion knowing that checking stuff off of a spiritual to-do list was a worthless pursuit. He would have confidence and the ability to laugh at himself, and he could love people without expecting anything in return. It would be quite beautiful, really. So I don't know, you tell me, what message do you think I need? What message do you think you need to hear over and over and over again until it starts to sink in? So that is the message of this book of Esther for us. Because if you're here and you still don't think he loves you, let this book sink in. And let me just go one step further and say this. Maybe it's not so much that you don't think God could really love you. Maybe you've gone a step further and you say, if I were just totally honest, it's not politically correct to say it, and I would never say it out loud, but I just don't love God. I just don't really care for him. And you see, that's critical too, because this book still speaks to you. God is still looking out after Esther, who doesn't even care to go back to the land. God is still there. And to the degree that you let that kind of overwhelming love sink into your heart, it'll change you from the inside out. That's the story of grace. That is the story of the gospel. That is the Old Testament leading us to what just happens on Calvary as the natural expression of the kind of God we see in the Old Testament, who's coming again for all of us. And that's the story, best I know it, of the Old Testament. So enjoy your New Testament classes and recognize this. When you turn the page over from the last page of the Old Testament, it's going to start in Matthew 1:1, and it's going to say the genealogy, and you're going to say, oh boy, I love those. The genealogy, the book of the record of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And you're going to say, wow. That first verse is packed with everything. 2 Samuel 7, Genesis chapter 12, the Savior, the Redeemer of the world. And you're going to understand the New Testament in ways you never expected and never able to do it before. All right?